Set correct. Okay. Distinguished speaker and dear participant, namaste and good afternoon, good morning in America. Welcome to a very special webinar on war and peace in the Taiwan Strait. Before I start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal, working towards bringing in research excellence in the field of international relations, international economy, security and development, and looking for better approaches for enhanced international cooperation and relations for a better, peaceful and stable world. Today's topic is of great relevance because we all are aware that the recent tension in the Taiwan Strait. Recently, there was a visit by Nancy Pelosi, a Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, to Taiwan, which was followed by Chinese aggressive military exercise around Taiwan. And there are concerns how the crisis over Taiwan will change US-China relation because it is going to impact the world. It is in this context we have invited a very distinguished scholar, Dr. Scott Kastner, who has published a book on this topic. Dr. Scott L. Kastner is an associate professor in the Department of Governance and Politics, University of Maryland, College Park. He graduated from Cornell University in 1995 and received his Ph.D. in political science from the University of California, San Diego in 2003. Scott Kastner's research interests include international relations, international political economy, the international politics of East Asia, and China's foreign relations. Current projects include the political consequences of China's external economic ties and the prospects of conflict in the Taiwan Strait with Margaret, Pearson, and Chad Rector, and the determinants of variation in Chinese behavior in global governance. He is author of Political Conflict and Economic Interdependence Across Taiwan Strait and Beyond, which is being published by Stanford University Press, which was published by Stanford University Press 2009. And he also was the co-editor with Ming-Chin Monique Chu of Globalization and Security Relations Across the Taiwan Strait in the Shadow of China, which was published by Routledge in 2015. His work has also appeared in following journals like International Security, Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, Comparative Political Studies, Security Studies, Journal of Peace Research, Foreign Policy Analysis, Journal of Contemporary China, Journal of East Asian Studies, Issues and Studies, and Current History. This session is of 60 minutes, and the program is streaming live on several Facebook pages and several local media as well. We'd like to request all our participants to tweet about this event and also share it on their social media so that maximum can benefit from this discussion. The audience can drop their questions on the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat, or you can also tweet, or you can send us on via WhatsApp. Professor Kastner, over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. And I want to also kind of thank the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement for inviting me here, and thank everyone for attending the presentation today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to go ahead and use. Okay. Does that look pretty good?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So, in my talk today, I want to talk a little bit about prospects for conflict and peace in the Taiwan Strait, and the presentation that I'm going to give is based on a book that I just published with Columbia University Press, War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait, which came out a couple of months ago. And so, what I want to do in my talk today is just give a little bit of kind of background into kind of the motivation for the project and kind of some of my thinking in the book about kind of how a conflict in the Taiwan Strait could potentially occur. Okay, so I think it goes without saying that the Taiwan Strait today is widely seen as one of the most dangerous potential flashpoints for conflict in East Asia. And we saw this pretty clearly last year with then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and kind of the tensions that followed that visit, including a series of pretty extensive military exercises from the PRC, and some threatening rhetoric and so forth. And a number of officials in the United States have warned in recent years about an increasing risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We saw a couple of years ago the commander of Indo-PACOM in testimony to Congress warning about the possibility of conflict in the Taiwan Strait in the next 6 years or so. And even this past fall, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, suggested that the PRC may be on an increased timetable or a quicker timetable to try to achieve unification. So this is something that's getting a lot of attention, obviously, in Washington. I think it's worth noting, though, that it wasn't that long ago that relations across the Taiwan Strait seemed to be stabilizing. So during the presidency of Ma Ying-jeou, who was Taiwan's president from 2008 to 2016, seen here on the left, we actually saw kind of a period of unprecedented detente in cross-strait relations. We saw a lot of dialogue between the two sides, a raft of agreements, including especially economic agreements that largely normalized the bilateral economic relationship. And of course, this was kind of a process that in some sense kind of culminated with this unprecedented leadership meeting between President Ma and Chinese President Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015. So this is a time when the Taiwan Strait had really moved to the back burner in Washington, and there wasn't a lot of talk about the potential for conflict in the Taiwan Strait. People were focused on other issues like the North Korean nuclear issue, the Iranian nuclear issue, the South China Sea disputes, and so forth. This, of course, all changed pretty dramatically beginning in 2016 with the election of Tsai Ing-wen, Taiwan's current president, as president in a landslide election that year. Even though Tsai, I think, is correctly in Washington kind of viewed as being quite moderate in her approach to cross-strait issues, she hasn't been willing to accommodate the PRC on core sovereignty issues to the same extent as her predecessor, Ma Ying-jeou. And in particular, she has been unwilling to endorse or accept this kind of idea that Taiwan should be thought of as a part of China in principle. In turn, the PRC has steadily ratcheted up coercive pressure against Taiwan during the Tsai presidency. Beijing cut off all dialogue with Taiwan and made a resumption of dialogue kind of contingent on some sort of clear acceptance of a one China principle in Taipei. And we've seen kind of a range of kind of coercive measures adopted toward Taiwan over the past several years, including diplomatic pressure, such as picking off Taiwan's diplomatic allies, trying to kind of limit Taiwan's participation in international fora. We've seen some economic pressure directed against Taiwan, and most visibly, we've seen kind of a ratcheting up of military pressure against Taiwan, including, if you've watched the news the past couple of weeks, frequent incursions into Taiwanese airspace, crossing the midline of the Taiwan Strait with military aircraft, circumnavigating the island with military aircraft, and so forth. And so it's quite clear that that the relations over the past several years have become quite tense, and this kind of leads to the basic question that I ask in the book is how worried should we be about the possibility of armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And I kind of begin by noting that that there's different takes on this issue among scholars and analysts in Washington. And part of the reason why people kind of come to different conclusions about how high the risk of actual military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is that assessing the prospects for conflict is actually quite difficult because the cross-strait relationship over the past few decades has been characterized by a number of complex and at times contradictory trends that have at times kind of ambiguous implications for the prospects for military conflict. And so let me just give a couple of examples of some of these trends. So I think the most obvious trend over the past few decades has been a rapid shift in the military balance of power in the region and in the Taiwan Strait in particular. Here I've put up just kind of a crude kind of indicator of that shifting balance, just to kind of, this is a graph that shows military spending in the PRC and Taiwan in constant dollars dating back to the late 1980s. And it's pretty obvious that military spending is largely flatlined in Taiwan, even as it's grown exponentially in China. Again, this is a kind of a crude measure of the military balance of power, but it reflects what I think is kind of a widely shared view that the balance is shifting pretty sharply, and to an increasing extent, it's becoming unclear, even if the US were to intervene in a cross-strait conflict, whether it could do so effectively. And so on the one hand, this is quite worrisome if we're thinking about the prospects for conflict, because it suggests that the PRC may have kind of growing incentive to use its increasing military capabilities to try to accomplish its long-held goal of national unification forcefully. On the other hand, to the degree that leaders in Beijing are confident that these sorts of trends are likely to continue, it also potentially gives Beijing reason to be patient and to continue to wait for a time where conditions are even more favorable to achieve unification at relatively low cost. Another kind of obvious trend that's characterized both the cross-strait relationship and the region more broadly has been, over the past few decades, deepening economic integration. Taiwan and if we kind of go back to the late 1990s, the United States was the largest trading partner of Taiwan, but this changed pretty dramatically in the 2000s. And over the last 20 years or so, the PRC has been by far Taiwan's largest trading partner. It's been the primary destination for Taiwan's outbound investment. And both the PRC and Taiwan, of course, are deeply integrated into global supply chains. And again, this is something that's potentially stabilizing, in that it kind of suggests that there's, if a conflict were to occur, it would come at very high cost for both Taiwan and the PRC. And this is especially the case if we think about Taiwan's importance in global supply chains, especially with the production of high-end semiconductors. On the other hand, it's worth noting that kind of integration has kind of flatlined to some degree over the past decade. We haven't kind of seen the same rapid growth in economic ties across the Taiwan Strait. Obviously, we have this kind of significant economic friction between the United States and China. And so it's not clear, kind of looking forward, the degree to which economic integration is going to continue to act as a kind of a constraint on conflict, like maybe it has in the past. And if we look at kind of political and social trends in Taiwan, again, we see kind of some contradictory trends. So on the one hand, if we're just thinking about kind of the prospects for military conflict, we could kind of look at trends in Taiwan identity over time. And so this is a survey that's asked in Taiwan, where respondents are asked, kind of going back to the early 1990s, whether they think of themselves as Chinese, Taiwanese, or both Chinese and Taiwanese. And the green line here is the percentage of respondents who answer solely Taiwanese. And we can see that over the past 15 years or so, this has emerged as a clear majority of respondents. Okay, so most individuals, when asked about identity, self-identify as solely Taiwanese and not Chinese in any way. And this is something that's potentially worrisome in that it kind of feeds into fears in China that Taiwan may be slipping away, and it perhaps adds to kind of urgency in Beijing about kind of the need to try to do something about this sooner rather than later. On the other hand, other surveys kind of suggest that there's still a lot of kind of pragmatism in Taiwan public opinion. So this is a survey that also kind of asked by kind of the same outfit as the previous one, that kind of goes back to the mid-1990s, kind of asking individuals their views on kind of final status issues, and it kind of gives people kind of a range of options from unification as soon as possible with the PRC to a range of kind of middling status quo options to independence as soon as possible, or formal independence. And what's notable here is that kind of consistently over the past few decades, the two responses that are kind of at the top, the black and blue lines in this chart, are responses where individuals don't even kind of indicate preferences at all over final status issues. So it's either maintain the status quo indefinitely, which is the blue line, or maintain the status quo and kind of make a decision about Taiwan's status at a later date, which is the black line. And these two lines, these kind of two views combined have kind of been a majority of respondents for some time. Okay, and so this suggests that there's still a lot of pragmatism. So even though we have kind of deepening Taiwan-centric identity on the island over the past few decades, there's still considerable pragmatism in terms of kind of an unwillingness to do something that might trigger a conflict with the PRC. Okay, so we have kind of these complex trends, and so what I was kind of hoping to do in the book manuscript is to try to kind of think through how we might kind of make sense of how we could fit these trends together. And so the approach that I adopt in the book is basically to develop kind of a simple, kind of highly stylized model that I use to kind of think through how a conflict could occur. And then I kind of use this model to kind of think through some of the implications of some of these trends that I just described. Okay, and so in the book, in kind of developing this model, I begin by noting that that both China and Taiwan have a mix of revisionist and status quo preferences related to Taiwan and Taiwan's status. So from China's perspective, on the one hand, there's kind of a clear status quo preference of halting what is seen in Beijing as kind of steps toward Taiwan's kind of formalization of its independent status, and kind of halting unfavorable political trends in Taiwan that seem to kind of be pushing Taiwan further away from the PRC's goal of unification, right? And so that's clearly this kind of opposition to Taiwan independence is clearly kind of a status quo position. And the PRC often kind of frames its rhetoric regarding Taiwan in terms of stopping Taiwan independence. So it kind of often frames what it's doing in status quo terms. But it's also worth noting, of course, that the PRC clearly holds highly revisionist preferences with regard to Taiwan, in that it wants to see Taiwan's kind of de facto independence come to an end, and it wants to accomplish the goal of formal unification with the island. Okay, and so that's obviously a highly revisionist goal. Taiwan, for its part, also has kind of a clear status quo preference, and often frames what it's doing in terms of its kind of status quo preferences as kind of wanting to avoid being coerced into unification, what sometimes kind of some analysts kind of refer to as kind of avoiding annexation by the PRC and so forth. And so that's very much a kind of a status quo goal. But there's also clear revisionist preferences in Taiwan. So there's widespread sentiment in Taiwan that the island should have more kind of space internationally to participate in international organizations and so forth. And many hold kind of more strongly revisionist preferences in Taiwan. Many believe that in principle, Taiwan should be kind of formally independent. Okay, so both sides have kind of a mix of status quo and revisionist preferences with regard to Taiwan's status, and this kind of implies two broad pathways to conflict that are kind of rooted in revisionist intentions by both sides. So on the one hand, you could imagine a conflict that's rooted in actual or potential efforts by Taiwan to formalize its independence, or to kind of take steps that effectively preclude unification as a viable future scenario. But you could also, of course, imagine conflict arising as a consequence of the PRC's own highly revisionist goals regarding national unification. Okay, so with that in mind, I developed kind of a highly stylized model that's rooted in kind of some of the bargaining and war literature in the international relations literature to kind of think through how conflict could actually occur. And to kind of think about how some of the trends that I described earlier might affect the likelihood of conflict. Okay, so the model conceptualizes Taiwan's potential status as lying on a continuum, and where you can imagine kind of formal unification with China lying at one end of this continuum, and that of course would be China's ideal outcome. And you could imagine Taiwan's kind of formal independence lying at the other end of the continuum. And here, just for simplicity, I label this as Taiwan's ideal outcome, though recognizing, of course, that this is also a contentious issue within Taiwan. And we could think of the status quo as lying somewhere between these two extremes. Taiwan, of course, enjoys de facto independence and autonomy today, but at the same time, it lacks international legal recognition, and it continues to, call itself the Republic of China. It has it still has a constitution dating back to the days when the ROC was still on the mainland and so forth. And so I think we could think of the status quo as lying kind of somewhere between these two extremes. And so if the two sides were to fight a war, this would result in kind of some outcome on this continuum. Here I've kind of arbitrarily just kind of placed the war outcome sort of in the middle of this continuum. Doesn't really matter where we put it in terms of kind of the logic of the model. And we could kind of think of this outcome in two ways. One is that you could kind of imagine that this is kind of the bargain that would emerge at the end of a war, some sort of negotiated settlement. Perhaps Taiwan agrees to kind of some weak version of a one China principle or whatever. You could also kind of think of it in terms of a probabilistic outcome, where kind of the greater the probability that the PRC would prevail in a conflict and be able to kind of impose its preferred outcome of unification, the further to the left on this continuum the war outcome would lie. Okay, war, of course, is costly, and I think it goes without saying that a war in the Taiwan Strait would be potentially quite catastrophic for both, most obviously for Taiwan, but also for the PRC. There would be most obviously extensive economic costs, but also probably substantial military costs, diplomatic costs, and significant loss of life would be almost certain were a war in the Taiwan Strait to take place. And these costs are going to detract from the utility that each side kind of gets from the war outcome. So once we kind of take into those costs into consideration, Taiwan's kind of war payoff wouldn't lie at point W. It would lie kind of further away from its ideal outcome of independence at a point where I've labeled T on this continuum. And China's war outcome would likewise be kind of further away from its ideal outcome of unification at a point here that I've labeled point R. And I've labeled it point R because you could kind of think of this as China's reversion point or its red line. So kind of the point at which it's indifferent between accepting some version of a status quo or fighting a war to try to obtain a better outcome. Okay, and so as long as the status quo resides to the left of point R in this kind of highly stylized model, the PRC prefers to accept that status quo rather than initiate conflict to try to accomplish something better. Okay, so with this model in mind, then I kind of tease out kind of the logic of kind of these two broad scenarios I just talked about, kind of this idea of kind of a revisionist Taiwan scenario where war is ultimately rooted in efforts by Taiwan to kind of move closer to its ideal outcome of independence, or conversely, whether war is rooted in kind of efforts by the PRC to try to accomplish its revisionist goals of unification. Okay, and so thinking about kind of a war rooted in Taiwan revisionism, in the book, I kind of outline a couple of possibilities here for how such a war could potentially occur. One possibility, and this is a possibility that got a lot of attention, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, was the idea of kind of a revisionist Taiwan government, basically taking actions that crossed PRC red lines relating to Taiwan status and thus kind of triggering a military response. And again, for a long time, I think many analysts viewed this as the most likely scenario for a cross-strait conflict, especially during the Lee Teng-hui and Chen Shui-bian administrations in Taiwan. So what sort of actions are we talking about? Well, we could kind of talk about efforts that we saw during those administrations to kind of raise Taiwan's international profile. Lee, for instance, took some high-profile visits abroad to Southeast Asia in 1994, and most famously to the United States in 1995 to give a talk at his alma mater, Cornell, which led to a prolonged crisis in the Taiwan Strait. We could also kind of think about statements made by leaders in Taiwan that concern kind of the nature of Taiwan's status and the nature of cross-strait relations, right? So Lee, when he was president in the late 1990s, kind of framed the cross-strait relationship as being a state-to-state relationship, which kind of implied that Taiwan was kind of a sovereign equal of the PRC. Chen Shui-bian kind of adopted a similar formulation when he was president. He kind of talked about each side of the Taiwan Strait being a separate country, again, kind of implying that Taiwan is a sovereign and independent country. And he often referred to Taiwan as such in his speeches and interviews while he was president. And Taiwan's current president, Tsai Ing-wen, has kind of indicated that as well, that she views Taiwan as being an independent country already, kind of implying, of course, that the Declaration of Independence isn't really necessary, but highlighting that she views Taiwan as independent and that Taiwan calls itself the Republic of China, Counter Taiwan. Okay, and then especially during the Chen administration, we saw kind of efforts to highlight Taiwan's otherness from China, what was sometimes referred to as kind of a de-Sinification campaign on the island. Examples included kind of efforts to kind of change the name of state entities that had China in the title to kind of replace that with Taiwan, adding Taiwan in English to the cover of the ROC passport, downgrading Chiang Kai-shek's legacy. This is kind of a picture on the right of what the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall looked like in the late stages of the Chen Shui-bian administration, shortly before he left office, where the lights were turned off, the honor guard was removed, and kites were hung from the ceiling, kind of obscuring the statue of Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, so these are all kind of steps that effectively kind of move Taiwan, you could kind of say, in the direction of formal independence. And of course, the danger in kind of the context of this model is that if these efforts kind of push too far and kind of move the status quo to the right of China's red line or reversion point, then China would be in a position where it would prefer to seek a military solution rather than accept a continuation of that status quo. I argue in the book that this sort of a scenario is primarily rooted in an information problem, where it's difficult for Taiwan to know with confidence where PRC red lines lie. And it's hard for the PRC to kind of communicate this information credibly. No leader in Taiwan, I believe, would kind of purposely cross PRC red lines on sovereignty issues just because war would be such a horrible outcome for Taiwan. But the danger is the difficulty is it's hard to know exactly what China's kind of red line actually is on some of these sovereignty issues. But I argue in the book that kind of over the past couple of decades, this kind of a scenario that really worried analysts in the 90s and 2000s has essentially become less likely. I argue that Taiwan's costs of conflict are getting unambiguously worse as the balance of military power shifts in China's favor, as Taiwan continues to be highly integrated into global markets and with the PRC in particular. This means that kind of the costs of flirting with China's red lines are getting higher, and I think that these trends are making Taiwan more cautious, and we see this, I think, during the Tsai presidency. I also argue that China's been quite effective at using costly signals, especially kind of military signals, to indicate clearly that major steps toward Taiwan independence are really risky for Taiwan, and I think that that China's military deterrence in this regard has helped to kind of signal to Taiwan that there are lines that should not be crossed. And I also kind of emphasize as well kind of the nature of what's being bargained over here. Taiwan already is kind of functionally independent. And so to the degree that it seeks kind of greater independence in the context of my model, it's mostly kind of seeking symbolic gains, right? Things like a change in the name, greater international legal recognition, and so forth. And I argue in the book that as kind of the costs of conflict go up from Taiwan's perspective, there's kind of less willingness to kind of risk those sorts of costs to obtain primarily symbolic additional gains. I do outline kind of a second kind of scenario for conflict rooted in Taiwan revisionism in the book. And this is one that I'm in the manuscript, I'm kind of more concerned about. And this is a kind of a scenario that's rooted not in kind of concrete steps that Taiwan could take today that kind of actually cross PRC red lines, but it's a scenario that's more rooted in kind of potential future Taiwan revisionism. And it's kind of rooted in a fear in Beijing that kind of looking to the future that Taiwan might be slipping away for good. And there's a couple of reasons why we might be kind of concerned about this line of thinking in Beijing. One is that there's kind of a sense in China that there are a number of kind of unfavorable social and political trends in Taiwan that I kind of touched on earlier, especially kind of this kind of deepening of Taiwan-centric identity, the difficulty of kind of the Nationalist Party in national elections has also kind of contributed to some PRC pessimism about political trends in Taiwan. But also, there's a lot of concern in Beijing about kind of deepening U.S.-Taiwan security relations and the possibility that over the long term, if those ties continue to deepen, it might effectively preclude the possibility of formal unification for the PRC. I argue in the book that this is a kind of a problem that resembles a credible commitment problem in that Taiwan's leaders have a difficult time kind of credibly committing not to alter trends in Taiwan's public opinion in the future and so forth. And this could lead to kind of a sense that time is not on Beijing's side and that it needs to act sooner rather than later to prevent Taiwan from becoming irretrievably not Chinese. But I do argue in the book that there are kind of some reasons to be at least somewhat optimistic that this sort of a kind of a scenario can be avoided. Most obviously, there's kind of Beijing also has kind of reasons to be optimistic about kind of where some things are headed in the Taiwan Strait, especially the military balance of power, which kind of give continued reasons for patience. But also, unless Beijing is really confident that it would prevail in a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, it's not clear that a military option really helps to resolve this problem. The use of military force, in fact, would likely backfire by reinforcing what Beijing views as unfavorable trends. It would probably make it more likely that the U.S. would enter into closer security relations with Taiwan, and it would make the PRC kind of even less attractive from the standpoint of Taiwan society. Okay, and so I think there's reasons to believe that even though this is a real risk, that there are some reasons to think that it's that this sort of a scenario can be avoided. Okay, and then finally, and I see that I'm maybe talking a little bit longer than I had thought, so I'll wrap it up here in about 2 minutes. I just wanted to kind of say a couple of words about kind of this other big kind of scenario through which conflict could arise in the Taiwan Strait, and this is kind of a scenario rooted in PRC revisionism, where the PRC kind of seeks to accomplish its own goal of national unification. Clearly, this is the scenario that's gaining the most attention in recent years, especially in Washington. And it's kind of rooted, again, I think most obviously in kind of the shifting balance of military power in the sense that Beijing's war utility may be improving. And so again, if we kind of think about this in the context of the model, it kind of suggests that to the degree that China's war utility is improving, that its red line is shifting to the left, closer to the unification end of the continuum. And if that if China's red line were to kind of shift left to the status quo, right, then we'd be in a position where the PRC would prefer a military option over a continuation of that status quo. Obviously, there's reasons if we get into that kind of a scenario for Taiwan to try to accommodate and avoid a military outcome, a military conflict outcome. John Mearsheimer, for instance, kind of wrote a very well-known article in the National Interest several years ago, Say Goodbye to Taiwan, where he basically kind of argued that kind of shifts in the regional military balance of power are making it inevitable that Taiwan's going to have to accommodate on sovereignty issues and eventually is going to move closer to kind of a Hong Kong type solution. But I argue in the book that it's really unlikely that that sort of a process is going to happen peacefully. It's really hard for the PRC to signal credibly that its red line is shifted. There's not a lot of support for sovereignty related accommodations in Taiwan. I argue for a number of reasons, and I could get into these in Q&A, that credible commitment problems are likely to loom really large. And more generally, people tend to be resistant to bargaining away things that they believe that they already have. which in this case, there's widespread sense in Taiwan that Taiwan is a sovereign independent state, and I think there's going to be great reluctance to want to give that up. And so kind of looking to the future, I do worry that if we ever get into a situation where China's red line kind of crosses to the left of the status quo, where China believes that it could get a better outcome using military force than it gets in the status quo, that would be a really dangerous situation, and hence kind of policy should be kind of directed at kind of preventing that sort of situation from arising in the first place. Okay, so I'm sorry to go a little bit long. I'll stop talking now, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'll stop my share as well here.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Scott Kastner. Thank you so much for very interesting, very enlightening, thought-provoking, and comprehensive remarks. We have received lots of questions, around 20-25 questions, and I'm sure it will be doubled in a few minutes. Hence, without wasting much time, let me share some of them. We have received lots of questions which we have addressed during the presentation, and I'm trying to club them together. That there are lots of questions on how Taiwan Strait can be safeguarded and peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is achieved, which you have briefly answered. If you want to add something to that, to it. Second is that, yeah, please.
Oh, good. So you want me to just say a little bit more about kind of how Taiwan's kind of security can be safeguarded and how conflict can be avoided in the Taiwan Strait?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a good question. And there's obviously kind of a lot of debate going on right now, just in terms of kind of in terms of kind of military things that Taiwan can do to improve deterrence and so forth. I don't really want to speak greatly to that, other than to note that there are many that argue that Taiwan can do a lot to increase kind of its deterrence, to make its deterrence more credible by, for instance, kind of embracing asymmetric strategies and so forth of defense. But set aside that, in the book, kind of I argue that there are maintaining kind of stability in the Taiwan Strait. There are kind of a couple kind of countervailing things that the U.S. has to kind of keep in mind in Taiwan, right? So on the one hand, there's kind of a need to kind of focus on deterrence, right, and deal with the fact that PRC military capabilities are growing, and this is kind of feeds into kind of efforts to kind of increase security cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan, to kind of see Taiwan kind of invest in more robust asymmetric defense capabilities and so forth, kind of to get its reserve system kind of upgraded and so forth. But at the same time, I argue that policymakers need to be really kind of cognizant of kind of how Beijing kind of views the status quo. And so deterrence is really important, but it's also really important to kind of reassure Beijing that efforts to deter PRC revisionism don't have the effect of precluding unification as a long-term viable scenario. So I kind of argue that it's important, and a number of other scholars kind of make similar arguments. It's important to kind of reassure Beijing that in particular kind of efforts by the U.S. to increase security ties with Taiwan are defensive and not aimed at precluding unification over the longer term. And I argue that there should also be kind of a piece of this where there's kind of an effort to kind of keep to encourage Beijing to kind of continue to have kind of a stake in a stable status quo, and this ultimately means trying to prevent kind of a complete breakdown in the U.S.-China relationship, which has really soured, obviously, in recent years. And so I think that U.S. policymakers kind of need to kind of keep in mind kind of broader implications for U.S.-China relations when they formulate policy in the Taiwan Strait. So I'll just kind of keep it there, and I'm happy to elaborate.
So you said that Taiwan strategy is defensive, but there's lots of questions that do you see the possibility of nuclear Taiwan in the future?
So my view is it's unlikely. The reason why I think it's not impossible, right? And you could kind of give, certainly Taiwan in the past had secret nuclear programs, during the kind of pre-democratization era that later kind of came to light. You could kind of think about why, certainly kind of having a robust nuclear deterrent would be potentially quite useful for Taiwan in terms of kind of deterring an effort to kind of resolve this issue using military force. But I think kind of the process of kind of moving toward that outcome would be incredibly destabilizing. It would be really hard. Like I'm just going to kind of speculate that it would be really hard for Taiwan to kind of keep this secret if it were kind of moving toward developing a nuclear capability. And if the PRC kind of got wind of it, it generates really, really powerful first strike incentives for Beijing. And I don't personally think that Beijing would hesitate to use a military option to take out a suspected nuclear program in Taiwan. And so my view is that it's unlikely, just because it would be incredibly dangerous for Taiwan to pursue this sort of an option.
Amit has asked, do you see, will Quad be effective response to safeguard Taiwan Strait? If India is excluded from Quad policy framing, how effective can it be?
Wait, can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Will Quadrilateral alliance of US, Australia, India, and Japan be an effective response to safeguard Taiwan Strait?
So with the Quad, is the Quad likely to kind of be effective in helping to safeguard security for Taiwan?
Yes.
So I think it's something that it contributes to greater deterrence, right? To the degree that there's kind of credible and robust kind of multilateral security cooperation in the region, it potentially kind of raises the costs from Beijing's perspective of pursuing a military option in the Taiwan Strait. It's I don't think it's obvious that the how much the Quad would actually kind of apply to a Taiwan contingency. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. But I think kind of in kind of the broader perspective of kind of a more kind of a greater level of security cooperation in the region and kind of a greater degree of kind of US security ties with other countries in the region certainly has the potential to improve deterrence.
Another question is who is changing the status quo of the Taiwan Strait, and who should be responsible for the current escalation of the situation in Taiwan Strait? Who is changing the status quo and who is responsible? There are lots of questions that is such tension in Taiwan interest? Having this kind of tension, does it help Taiwan?
Does having tension help Taiwan? I don't think so. I think it's. I mean, my personal view is that kind of this kind of constant level of military pressure directed against Taiwan is and certainly the economic pressure that we've seen in recent years kind of directed against Taiwan is not in Taiwan's interest. I really have a hard time kind of seeing how that actually benefits anyone in Taiwan, and at least kind of broadly. Maybe you could kind of make an argument about kind of certain vested interests that might kind of benefit from kind of constant tensions at Taiwan Strait. But generally speaking, I don't think it's good at all.
The other question, what political commitments have the United States of America and the European Union made to the Taiwan question?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity still in Taiwan, in U.S. Taiwan policy. I don't want to really speak to the EU. I'm not super well versed in kind of specific commitments that the EU has made. My sense is that the EU is much less has really not made a clear security commitment to Taiwan. But the U.S. certainly there are extensive security commitments that have been made. Most obviously, we can kind of look at things like the Taiwan Relations Act. We can look at kind of statements made by U.S. officials, which have grown stronger in recent years, right? So President Biden has noted on several occasions now that the United States would intervene in the event of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, which is something that we haven't seen, generally speaking, presidents make in the past, right? So George W. Bush kind of said something to this effect once, and the White House kind of immediately backtracked, and he didn't repeat it. And so we've seen kind of more kind of explicit statements coming from leadership in the United States, and it's not just the president, right? The kind of formulation coming out of the State Department has been stronger in recent years, kind of describing the U.S. Security commitment to Taiwan as being rock solid, which is less ambiguous than it used to be. We've seen kind of the United States kind of announcing military transits in the Taiwan Strait, which it used to not do. We've seen the U.S. kind of being more willing to sell advanced weapons to Taiwan, including kind of the upgraded F-16s a few years ago. And so I think that there are reasons to think that U.S. security ties with Taiwan have gotten stronger, and that the U.S. commitment has gotten stronger to Taiwan in recent years. But that said, there's still a lot of ambiguity. And the official U.S. position is still pretty vague about the conditions under which the U.S. would get involved in a conflict. Obviously, there's no formal alliance treaty. There's still very limited kind of joint exercises and so forth between the two sides. And so there's still a lot of, I think, ambiguity in the U.S. commitment.
There are many questions which you have answered that the war on Taiwan Strait can be costly. But there are lots of questions like, do you see the possibility of any military conflict in Taiwan Strait? And do you see China using force to unify Taiwan? Do you see the possibility of China and US fighting a war for Taiwan? There's lots of questions coming within this periphery. There's another question that Xi Jinping has put Taiwan unification as top priority. Do you see the possibility of China unifying Taiwan during his tenure?
Yeah, so I don't think that unification with Taiwan is Xi Jinping's top priority. I think Xi Jinping, I think it's a priority, and it's a goal that the PRC clearly has, and it has had it for a long time. Xi Jinping has suggested that it's perhaps kind of something that he's more interested in making progress on. He's kind of indicated that it's not something that he wants to pass down to future generations, or that's an issue that shouldn't be passed down from generation to generation. He's kind of linked it to this kind of idea of kind of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and so forth. But I don't by any means kind of view this as his top priority. I think his top priority is his top priorities are domestic in nature. They're staying in power, maintaining kind of stability within the PRC, especially kind of at a time where there's a lot of problems in China, certainly in the near term, economic problems with kind of handling of COVID and so forth. So I don't view this as his top priority, but I do view it as a priority. And yes, and certainly it's something that there is a risk that at some point that China might resort to kind of a military option regarding Taiwan if there's confidence that the PRC could prevail at acceptable cost in the Taiwan Strait. And again, this is something I'm sorry that I kind of rushed the end of my talk, but this is I spend a lot of time in the book manuscript kind of talking about this possibility, and it is worrisome in that if the PRC kind of gets to the point where the shifting balance of power in the Taiwan Strait is such that leaders in Beijing kind of believe that there's a high likelihood of prevailing at acceptable costs in the Taiwan Strait, then I think that they would seriously consider using a military option. And yes, it could involve the United States. I think that there is a high likelihood that the U.S. would intervene in some way if there were a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. that's quite scary, right? Because that would involve ultimately a confrontation between two nuclear powers.
Yes, we're running out of time, so let me put one or two maximum question. Like there
Okay.
are lots of rumor. There were lots of rumor after Russia-Ukraine conflict that China might try similar adventurism on Taiwan. Do you see such possibilities? Second, will US fight for Taiwan? Because some believes that the US did not stand with Ukraine militarily. So, so while the Taiwanese question, and there are lots of questions that can Taiwan question and Ukraine issue be comparable? So that is one. Second, the last question will be, how do you view Nancy Pelosi's visit?
Okay, yeah. So with Ukraine, I mean, there obviously there's some similarities, right? So in both cases, you have a large authoritarian country that kind of is making kind of sovereignty claims on a neighboring state. Potentially, in the case of Ukraine, you actually have war, and kind of a PRC claims to Taiwan, and some superficial sense kind of look kind of similar. I think that there's also, I mean, huge differences, right? So I think you have to be really careful about drawing inference about likely U.S. behavior in the Taiwan Strait based on how the U.S. has responded to the Ukraine conflict. The U.S. has always been cautious about making commitments to Ukraine's security, much more cautious than it has been with regard to Taiwan even. And even though there's been considerable caution with regard to Taiwan, the logistics of kind of intervening are completely different. The U.S. would have to, to become military involved in Ukraine would involve kind of sending in an army, whereas a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would primarily be a kind of a naval contest for the United States. And so you could kind of go on and on. I think it's just really hard. It's really hard to kind of balance kind of the relative security importance of Ukraine versus Taiwan to the United States. My own view is that Taiwan is more important strategically to the U.S. Than Ukraine is, and so I think that you have to be really cautious in drawing inference. And I've actually, I think that no one expected that the U.S. was going to intervene directly militarily in the case of Ukraine. I don't think that any serious scholar believed that, but if anything, there's been quite a bit of U.S. and U.S. support for Ukraine, and I think it's in some sense kind of surprising to me the degree to which the U.S. has been willing to show support for Ukraine in ways that that directly antagonize Russia. So again, that kind of implies kind of a willingness to risk some level of conflict in order to kind of advance what are seen as U.S. security objectives in the region. So I don't want to kind of go too far, but so but I do think that there's limits to kind of how much inference you can draw, because it's kind of apples and oranges in a lot of ways. The Pelosi visit, my view is that I think she had a certainly had a kind of a right to go, and I don't want to kind of question her motives for wanting to go to Taiwan. I'm not personally sure that it was kind of the wisest thing to do, in that it kind of intensified tensions, and it kind of sets a kind of a precedent for future speakers potentially of the U.S. House to go to Taiwan, and I worry that we're going to kind of see this. Not so much worry that about I think that in principle, U.S. officials should be able to go to Taiwan, especially officials who are not kind of part of the executive branch, right? And so this isn't even something that's kind of deviating from longstanding U.S. policy. But I do worry about it kind of becoming something that's kind of seen as a way of kind of scoring political points within the United States. And I think that kind of talk of kind of a Republican speaker also going to Taiwan in the not too distant future. That's largely, it's something it's not a way of kind of for the U.S. to signal support for Taiwan. It's a way of kind of scoring some kind of political points domestically in the U.S. And so I do worry a little bit about the Taiwan issue kind of being overly politicized within the U.S. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Scott Kastner. Finally, here you come to the end of the discussion. Thank you so much for your insightful discussion. We still have lots of questions, but due to time constraints, we are unable to take them. It was a great session. We hope to have you in future, maybe in person in Kathmandu. We'd also like to thank our participants for this wonderful question. Thank you so much. Good night to our friends in Asia, and have a nice day, Doctor.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you, sir.